Picture a narrow country road cutting through the darkness of rural Wisconsin. The asphalt is cracked and worn, bordered by dense walls of corn that rustle in the wind like whispered warnings. There are no streetlights here, no houses visible from the pavement. Just the twin beams of your headlights pushing weakly against an ocean of black. This is Bray Road, and on any map, it looks like nothing special. Just another forgotten lane where farmers haul their equipment and locals take shortcuts between small towns. But something happened here that transformed this ordinary stretch of blacktop into one of the most documented locations for cryptid encounters in American history. Starting in the late 1980s and continuing right through to the present day, dozens of witnesses have reported seeing something on Bray Road that shouldn't exist. Not a bear, not a dog, not anything that fits comfortably into our understanding of the natural world. These weren't anonymous reports called in by attention seekers or kids spinning tales around a campfire. These were credible people. A newspaper reporter, a hospital employee, a county social worker. Ordinary citizens going about their ordinary lives until the moment they saw something that shattered their sense of what was possible. What they described defies easy explanation. A creature covered in fur, massive and powerful, with eyes that reflected light like an animal's. But here's what separated these sightings from every bear or wolf encounter. This thing walked upright. It moved on two legs with a gait that suggested intelligence, purpose, awareness. And when witnesses locked eyes with it, they didn't see the blank stare of a wild animal. They saw something looking back at them, something that seemed to recognize what they were. The question hangs in the cold Wisconsin air like fog. What if the old stories weren't just stories? What if werewolves, or something very much like them, are not safely contained within the pages of folklore and film, but prowling the edges of our modern world, just beyond the reach of our headlights? When night horror. The spade bit into the Wisconsin earth with a sound Mark Shackleman had grown familiar with over the past several days. It was late autumn in 1936, and the air carried that particular stillness that comes just before winter truly claims the land. Shackleman had come to this spot near Jefferson, a small farming community in the southern part of the state, with a purpose that many of his neighbors considered questionable at best. He was digging into an ancient Indian burial mound, one of thousands that dotted the landscape of Wisconsin, remnants of cultures that had thrived here centuries before European settlement. Mark Shackleman was not a reckless man, nor was he given to flights of fancy. At 43 years old, he had already lived through experiences that would break lesser men. He had served in the Great War, that mechanized nightmare that Europeans were already calling World War I, though few imagined there would be reason for a second. He had seen the mud of Flanders, had heard the whistle of artillery shells, had watched friends disappear into clouds of mustard gas. The war had taught him to trust his eyes, to rely on his instincts, and to recognize when something was deeply, fundamentally wrong. What drew him to this particular mound remains a matter of some speculation. Some accounts suggest he was an amateur archaeologist, driven by genuine curiosity about the native peoples who had shaped this land. Others whisper that he was searching for artifacts, perhaps even treasure, though Shackleman himself never spoke of such mercenary motivations. What we know for certain is that on this particular evening, as the sun began its descent toward the horizon and shadows grew long across the field, Mark Shackleman was alone at the mound, several feet of excavated earth piled around him, when he looked up and saw something that would haunt him for the remainder of his life. The creature stood perhaps 7 feet tall, its posture unmistakably upright, undeniably bipedal. In the fading light, Shackleman could see that it was covered entirely in dark hair, a coat of fur that seemed to absorb what little illumination remained in the day. But it was the face that froze him in place, the face that made his hands go numb around the handle of his spade. The thing had the head of a dog, or perhaps a wolf, but elongated, watching him with eyes that reflected an intelligence no animal should possess. For a moment, that seemed to stretch into eternity, man and creature regarded each other across the disturbed earth of the burial mound. Shackleman would later try to describe that moment to the few people he trusted enough to tell. He spoke of a primal recognition, something that bypassed his conscious mind entirely and spoke directly to the most ancient parts of his brain, the parts that remembered when humans were prey as often as predators. Every instinct screamed at him to run, to drop his tools and flee across the field toward the distant lights of town. But his legs would not respond. The war had taught him fear, had shown him the face of death in 100 different forms, but nothing in those trenches had prepared him for this. Then the creature made a sound. Shackleman would wrestle with how to describe this vocalization for years afterward. It was not quite a growl, not quite a word, but something unsettlingly between the two. He became fixated on one particular detail, repeating it to anyone who would listen. The sound had 3 syllables. 3 distinct syllables, rhythmic and deliberate, like a word in a language never meant for human tongues. Gadara, Dachsa. That was how he eventually tried to render it phonetically, though he admitted the sounds did not quite fit into any linguistic framework he knew. The sun continued its descent, and in the gathering darkness, the creature turned. It did not flee or scramble away like a startled animal. It turned with purpose, with an eerie dignity, and walked into the deepening shadows between the trees that bordered the field. Shackleman found his legs would finally obey him, and he gathered his tools with shaking hands, leaving the mound exactly as it was, the excavation abandoned. He told himself he would not return. He told himself that whatever he had seen, whatever had emerged from the woods near that ancient burial site, was none of his concern. Let the dead keep their secrets. But the human mind is a curious thing, particularly when it belongs to a man like Mark Shackleman. He was not someone who could simply accept the impossible and move on. The war had taught him that the world was larger and stranger than the comfortable stories people told themselves. But it had also taught him to face his fears, to confront what terrified him rather than run from it. 3 days later, as the November cold began to settle over Jefferson in earnest, he found himself returning to the mound. He told himself he was going to fill in the excavation, to restore the site and perhaps apologize, in his own way, to whatever spirits or forces he might have disturbed. He told himself he needed to see the place again in daylight, to prove to himself that his mind had not invented the entire encounter, that exhaustion and the failing light had not conjured a monster from shadows and fear. These were the stories he told himself as he made his way back across the field, tools in hand, his breath visible in the cold air. The mound looked exactly as he had left it, the exposed earth dark against the frost-touched grass. Shackleman set to work, methodically beginning to push the excavated soil back into place. The physical labor felt good, gave him something to focus on besides the memory of those eyes, that face, that impossible 3-syllable sound. He fell into a rhythm, the scrape of the shovel and the thud of falling earth becoming almost meditative. He did not hear it approach. That was what disturbed him most in his later recollections. A creature of that size, moving through the November woods, should have made some sound. Branches should have cracked, leaves should have rustled. But the first indication Mark Shackleman had, that he was no longer alone, was a sensation. That same primal warning system that had frozen him 3 days earlier. He looked up slowly, already knowing what he would see. It stood in exactly the same spot as before, as if it had never left, as if it had been waiting these 3 days for his return. The creature regarded him with that same unsettling intelligence, and in the clearer light of midday, Shackleman could see details he had missed in the evening gloom. The hands, if they could be called that, appeared almost human in their structure, though covered in the same dark hair. The muscles beneath that coat of fur suggested a strength far beyond human capability. And the face, that terrible canine face, seemed almost to be studying him, evaluating him. This time, Shackleman did not wait. He had seen enough, had his confirmation that his memory had not deceived him. He gathered his tools with as much calm as he could muster, never turning his back on the creature, moving with the slow deliberation of someone trying not to trigger a predator's chase instinct. The creature watched him go, making no move to follow, no sound except for that same 3-syllable utterance, quieter this time, almost conversational. Gadara. The word, if it was a word, seemed to hang in the cold November air long after Shackleman had put distance between himself and the mound. He never returned to that site. The excavation remained, slowly filling in naturally over the seasons that followed, until nothing marked the spot where Mark Shackleman had twice encountered something that should not exist. He told his story to a small circle of friends and family, People who knew him as a sober, reliable man, not given to fantasy or exaggeration. Most listened politely, and then quietly concluded that the war had left scars not all visible, that trauma could manifest in strange ways, that perhaps Mark had seen a bear or a wolf, and his mind, already unsettled by disturbing a burial site, had transformed it into something more. But those who knew him best, who had served with him or grown up alongside him, could see the truth in his eyes when he spoke of the creature. This was not the uncertain recollection of a half-remembered dream, or the embellishment of a tall tale. This was testimony, delivered with the same careful precision he had brought to describing enemy positions or identifying artillery types. Mark Shackleman knew what he had seen, and the knowing of it changed something fundamental in how he moved through the world. The years passed. Shackleman lived out his life in Jefferson, a respected member of the community, his strange experience gradually fading into local lore, the kind of story old-timers might tell on slow evenings, but never quite believe. When he died, the details of his encounter died with him, preserved only in fragments of second-hand accounts and the fading memories of those he had told. For decades, the incident seemed destined to be nothing more than a curious footnote, another unexplained oddity in a world full of mysteries. But Mark Shackleman had seen something genuine near that ancient burial mound, something that would eventually emerge again, following the same pattern he had first documented. The creature covered in hair, standing upright, with the face of a beast and an intelligence that defied explanation. The appearance near sacred or ancient sites. The three-syllable vocalization that sounded almost like speech. In 1936, Mark Shackleman became the first person to document what would eventually become known as the Beast of Bray Road, though that name would not emerge for more than 50 years. He established the template, recorded the characteristics that future witnesses would report with eerie consistency. But his encounter would be forgotten, buried as surely as the artifacts in that Indian mound, until the pattern repeated and someone finally recognized that this was not new, that the impossible thing stalking the rural roads of Wisconsin had been seen before, had been described before by a credible witness whose testimony deserved to be remembered. The evening cold settled over Elkhorn, Wisconsin, as Dorothy Gibson guided her car along the familiar curves of Bray Road. It was late October 1989, and the kind of chill that seeped through car doors had already begun signaling the approach of a hard winter. Gibson had driven this route countless times, a narrow stretch of rural asphalt flanked by cornfields and patches of dark woodland. She knew every bend, every dip in the pavement. What she was about to encounter would transform this ordinary commute into something that would haunt her for the rest of her life. As her headlights swept across the road ahead, something caught her attention. Near the shoulder, hunched over what appeared to be roadkill, was a large, dark form. Her first thought was immediate and practical. A dog. Perhaps a stray that had wandered from one of the nearby farms, scavenging whatever unfortunate creature had met its end on the asphalt. She eased off the accelerator, slowing down out of concern she might startle the animal into darting across her path. It was a reasonable reaction, the kind of cautious driving that comes naturally to people who spend time on rural roads, where deer and other animals create constant hazards. But as her vehicle slowed, and the distance between them closed, the creature did something that shattered every rational explanation her mind was attempting to construct. It stood up. Not the way a dog rises to all fours, not the lumbering shift of a bear repositioning its weight. This thing stood the way a human being stands, rising on its hind legs with a fluid, deliberate motion that spoke of natural bipedal movement rather than some awkward attempt at balance. And as it reached its full height, Dorothy Gibson felt her breath catch in her throat. The creature towered over her car. Even seated inside her vehicle, she had to look upward to see its face, and what she saw there would become seared into her memory with the kind of clarity that trauma provides. The head was unmistakably wolf-like. She would later describe the elongated snout, the pointed ears that sat high on the skull, the fur that covered the entire visible body in a coat of dark hair. But wolves do not stand 6 feet tall. Wolves do not balance on 2 legs and turn to face approaching cars with an almost curious posture. The eyes caught the reflection of her headlights, creating that distinctive eye shine that anyone familiar with animals at night would recognize. But the intelligence behind those eyes, the way they seemed to assess her, felt wrong in a way she struggled to articulate even years later. Gibson sat frozen in her car, her foot hovering somewhere between the brake and the accelerator, her mind racing through every possible explanation. Bear. Right. It had to be a bear. Wisconsin had black bears, and they could stand on their hind legs. But even as she grasped for this rational explanation, she knew it was wrong. She had seen bears before, at the zoo, in nature documentaries, in photographs. The proportions were all wrong. The head was too narrow, too canine. The way it stood was too comfortable, too natural, not the temporary posture of a bear trying to get a better view or reach something overhead. This creature stood the way humans stand, with its weight centered and balanced, like walking on two legs was exactly what it was designed to do. For what felt like an eternity, but was probably only a handful of seconds, woman and creature regarded each other. Then, with a movement that suggested neither fear nor aggression, but rather a simple decision to depart, the thing turned and moved off the road, not dropping to all fours to run, but walking, striding on those hind legs into the darkness beyond the reach of her headlights. Dorothy Gibson sat in her idling car, her hands gripping the steering wheel, trying to process what she had just witnessed. Every instinct told her that what she had seen was impossible, yet the certainty of her own eyes, the absolute clarity of the encounter, left no room for doubt or dismissal. She drove home in a state of shock, her mind replaying those moments over and over, examining every detail as if repetition might somehow make the experience make sense. When she finally spoke about what she had seen, she faced the reaction that almost every witness to the impossible faces: skepticism. Gentle suggestions that perhaps the lighting had been poor, that shadows and expectations can play tricks on the mind, that surely there must be some rational explanation. But Gibson held firm to her account. This was no trick of light or shadow. This was no case of mistaken identity. She had seen what she had seen, and what she had seen was a creature that should not exist. What Dorothy Gibson did not know, what she could not have known in those immediate days following her encounter, was that she was not alone. The same stretch of Bray Road that had hosted her terrifying experience had been the site of other sightings, other encounters that witnesses had been reluctant to report for fear of ridicule. But as word of Gibson's experience began to circulate through the small community, something remarkable happened. Other voices began to emerge from the silence. A young woman named Lori Indrizi came forward with her own account from earlier that same year. She had been driving along Bray Road one evening when her headlights illuminated a figure crouched at the roadside. Like Gibson, her first assumption had been that she was looking at a person, perhaps someone kneeling down examining something on the ground. But as she drew closer, the wrongness of what she was seeing began to register. The figure was covered in grayish-brown hair. The back was muscular and hunched in a way that seemed animal rather than human. And then it turned its head toward her approaching vehicle, and she saw the face. The elongated snout, the pointed ears, the distinctly canine features attached to a body that was holding a posture no canine should be able to maintain. Indrizi had the presence of mind to note specific details. She observed the creature's hands, or paws, or whatever they might properly be called. The fingers were long, tipped with claws, but they curved and moved with a dexterity that seemed more hand-like than paw-like. The arms were positioned in front of the body, bent at the elbows, supporting its weight as it crouched. The overall impression was of something caught between forms, possessing attributes of both human and beast in a combination that nature had supposedly never produced. Another witness, a man who asked to remain anonymous for years before finally allowing his story to be shared, described an encounter that occurred while he was deer hunting in the wooded areas adjacent to Bray Road. He had been settled into his stand in the pre-dawn darkness, waiting for first light, when he became aware of something moving through the forest below him. The sound was wrong. Deer move with a certain rhythm, 4 legs producing a particular pattern of disturbance. What he was hearing suggested bipedal movement, 2 legs stepping in an alternating pattern. His first thought was that another hunter was approaching, though it seemed early for anyone to be moving through the woods so noisily. When the figure came into view in the dim light, he realized immediately that this was no human hunter. The shape was too large, too heavily built through the shoulders and upper body. It moved through the underbrush with a shambling gait that covered ground quickly despite appearing unhurried. The hunter sat absolutely still in his elevated position, barely breathing, watching as the creature passed beneath his stand close enough that he could hear the sound of its breathing, could smell a musky odor that reminded him of wet dog but stronger, more pungent. He never raised his rifle, never considered taking a shot. Some instinct deeper than conscious thought told him that engaging with this thing would be a mistake of potentially fatal proportions. The pattern that was emerging along Bray Road carried a particular kind of weight because of the nature of the witnesses. These were not people seeking attention or notoriety. Elkhorn was a small community where being labeled as crazy or attention-seeking carried real social costs. These were ordinary residents, people with jobs and families and reputations to maintain, coming forward despite every incentive to remain silent. They were farmers and nurses and teachers and factory workers. They had nothing to gain and potentially much to lose by speaking publicly about encounters with something that should not exist. What made their accounts particularly compelling was the consistency of the details across multiple independent witnesses. They all described a creature with wolf-like features, particularly in the head and facial structure. They all reported bipedal movement that appeared natural rather than forced or awkward. They all noted the substantial size of the creature, generally estimating height at between 6 and 7 feet when standing fully upright. They all described dark fur, though shades varied from nearly black to grayish brown. And they all conveyed the same sense of wrongness, the deep, instinctive reaction that what they were witnessing violated some fundamental understanding of how the world was supposed to work. The question that hung over all these accounts was simple and yet profoundly disturbing. What were these people seeing? The easiest dismissal would be to suggest misidentification of known animals. Black bears can stand on hind legs and might appear wolf-like in poor lighting. Large dogs, particularly breeds like Malamutes or wolf-dog hybrids, could potentially be mistaken for something more unusual. But the witnesses pushed back hard against these explanations. These were people familiar with the local wildlife, who had seen bears and deer and coyotes countless times. They knew what a dog looked like, even a very large dog. What they had encountered was categorically different. The psychology of eyewitness testimony presents legitimate challenges when evaluating any unusual sighting. Human perception is fallible. Memory is reconstructive rather than purely recordative. Fear and surprise can distort details, but these factors cut both ways. While they introduce potential for error, they also tend to make witnesses more cautious about their claims, more likely to second-guess themselves, more prone to adopting conventional explanations even when those explanations do not quite fit. The fact that these witnesses maintained their accounts despite social pressure and self-doubt suggested a bedrock certainty born from direct experience. As 1989 drew to a close and word of the sighting spread through Elkhorn and the surrounding communities, Bray Road began to acquire a reputation. What had been an ordinary rural route, distinguished only by its particularly dark and isolated character, became a place of interest and speculation. Some residents began avoiding the road after dark when other routes were available. Others, motivated by curiosity or skepticism, deliberately drove the stretch hoping for their own encounter. Local teenagers, displaying the particular fearlessness of youth, began including Bray Road in their late-night adventures, daring each other to stop at the spots where sightings had been reported. But beneath the growing folklore and the inevitable sensationalism that accompanies any unusual story, a more serious question persisted. Multiple witnesses, unconnected to each other, separated by months, and in some cases having no knowledge of each other's experiences, were describing the same impossible thing. They were not reporting vague shapes or ambiguous forms open to wide interpretation. They were providing detailed, specific descriptions of a creature that matched across accounts in ways that coincidence or mass hysteria could not easily explain. Something was happening along Bray Road. Something was being seen. And whether that something was a genuine unknown animal, a case of collective misperception, or something else entirely, the encounters of 1989 had established a pattern that would only grow stronger in the years to come. October 30th, 1999. The date matters because it sits on the edge of Halloween, when the boundary between the ordinary and the impossible feels thinnest. But what happened to Heather Bowie that night had nothing to do with costumes or pranks. It had everything to do with terror so pure and immediate that it would fundamentally change how investigators approached the Bray Road legend. Before Heather's encounter, the Beast of Bray Road existed primarily in whispered stories and second-hand accounts. After that night, there were photographs. There was physical evidence. There were scratches gouged into metal that no one could explain away. Heather was 18 years old, a senior at Elkhorn Area High School. She was the kind of student who worked hard, stayed out of trouble, and planned for a future that made sense. College applications, part-time job, normal teenage concerns about grades and friends and what came next. She was not someone who believed in monsters. She was not someone who went looking for the paranormal or spent time chasing local legends on back roads. In fact, she barely knew the stories about Bray Road. That particular stretch of rural highway meant nothing to her, except that it was the quickest route home from her shift at the restaurant where she waited tables on weekends. The night was cold and clear. The kind of late October darkness that arrives early and settles deep across the Wisconsin countryside. Heather left work around 11:15 that night, tired from a long shift, thinking about homework she still needed to finish, and maybe calling her boyfriend before bed. The roads were empty in that particular way rural highways get after dark, when you can drive for miles without seeing another pair of headlights. Just farmland and forest pressing close on either side, her high beams cutting a narrow tunnel through the blackness. She was driving south on Bray Road, about 2 miles from the intersection with Hospital Road, when something massive burst from the tree line on her right. It happened so fast that her brain struggled to process what her eyes were seeing. Something huge and moving with impossible speed, crossing directly into her path. Her first thought, the only thought that made any sense, was deer. The area was thick with white-tailed deer, and collisions were common enough that every local driver knew to watch for them, especially at night. Heather slammed on her brakes. Her tires screamed against the pavement. The car shuddered and skidded slightly to the left as she fought to keep control. Her heart hammered in her chest, adrenaline flooding her system with that sick, shaky feeling that comes with a near miss. The thing, whatever it was, had already disappeared into the darkness on the other side of the road. She sat there for a moment, hands gripping the steering wheel so tightly her knuckles went white, trying to catch her breath and assess whether she'd actually hit it. The rational part of her mind was already calculating. Had she felt an impact? She didn't think so. Maybe it had been close enough that she just barely missed it. But she needed to know. She needed to check for damage, maybe look for the animal if it was injured. That's what a responsible person did. That's what her parents had taught her. So despite the trembling in her hands and the voice in the back of her mind whispering that something felt wrong, she put the car in park and unbuckled her seatbelt. That's when she saw it in her side mirror. Movement. Something large, rising up from the ditch on the passenger side of her car. Not a deer. Absolutely not a deer. The shape was all wrong. The height was all wrong. It was standing on 2 legs. Heather's breath caught in her throat. Every instinct screamed at her to drive, to get out of there, but she was frozen, caught in that terrible moment of disbelief where your mind refuses to accept what your eyes are showing you. The thing moved closer to her car, and now she could see it more clearly in the glow of her taillights. It was massive, easily 7 feet tall, maybe more. The body had the hunched, powerful build of something that moved on all 4s, but was currently upright. Dark fur covered it completely, but it was the head that destroyed any possibility of rational explanation. The head was a wolf. Not dog-like, or bear-like, or any other comparison that might have offered comfort. It was a wolf's head, elongated snout, and pointed ears, sitting atop those broad, muscular shoulders. And it was looking directly at her. Then it moved toward the passenger side of her car. Deliberately. Purposefully. Not like an animal startled by a vehicle, but like something that had decided to investigate, to get closer. Heather felt her breath coming in short, panicked gasps. The creature bent down, lowering that massive wolf head toward her passenger window, and she could see its eyes now. They caught the light from her dashboard and reflected back with an amber glow that seemed to hold intelligence, awareness, intent. The creature raised one arm. Even through her panic, Heather's mind registered how wrong that arm looked. Too long. Too muscular. ending in a hand that was neither human nor animal but some nightmare hybrid. And the fingers, if you could call them that, ended in claws. Long, curved, wicked-looking claws that gleamed dully in the dim light. It reached toward her passenger door. Heather heard herself make a sound, something between a whimper and a scream, as those claws made contact with the metal. The noise was hideous. A scraping, scratching, dragging sound that set her teeth on edge and sent ice water flooding through her veins. The creature was testing the door, trying to figure out how to open it, and Heather realized with absolute clarity that the only thing standing between her and this impossible thing was a pane of glass and a car door lock. Her paralysis shattered. She slammed her foot down on the accelerator without even thinking to shift out of park. The engine revved uselessly, screaming. The creature's head snapped up, those amber eyes locking onto hers. She could see its breath fogging the window. She fumbled for the gearshift, her hands shaking so badly she could barely grip it, finally getting the car into drive as the scratching intensified. The sound of claws on metal grew more insistent, more violent. The car lurched forward and Heather pressed the accelerator to the floor. The tires spun briefly before catching, and she rocketed down Bray Road at a speed that was probably as dangerous as the thing she was fleeing. But she didn't care. She couldn't care. The only thought in her mind was distance, escape, getting as far away as possible from whatever that thing had been. She didn't slow down until she reached the lights of town. Even then, she kept checking her rearview mirror, expecting to see that massive shape loping after her on those two long legs. Her whole body was shaking. Tears streamed down her face. She pulled into a gas station parking lot and sat there under the fluorescent lights, trying to convince herself that she'd imagined it, that stress or exhaustion or the darkness had played tricks on her perception. Then she got out of the car and walked around to the passenger side. The scratches were unmistakable. 4 parallel gouges running from the window down across the door panel, deep enough that they'd cut through the paint and scored the metal beneath. They were evenly spaced, the width that claws might make, and they were fresh. She touched them with trembling fingers and felt the rough edges of torn metal. Heather called her parents. Then she called the police. Within an hour, she was sitting in her family's living room, wrapped in a blanket despite the warmth of the house, trying to explain to a sheriff's deputy what she'd seen. She could hear the skepticism in his questions, see the doubt in his eyes. But he went outside and photographed the car. He documented the scratches. He measured them. And when he came back inside, his expression had changed. Not to belief, exactly, but to uncertainty. The photographs were developed and filed in an official report. Investigators from various backgrounds examined them over the following weeks. Wildlife experts looked at the spacing and depth of the marks. Metallurgists analyzed how much force would be required to create scratches that deep in automotive steel. No one could offer a satisfactory conventional explanation. The gouges were too deep and too evenly spaced to be from a deer antler, too high on the door to be from road debris or a branch, too deliberate in their placement. Heather's car became a piece of evidence, not in a criminal case, but in the ongoing investigation into what people were seeing on Bray Road. Her testimony, combined with the physical proof, transformed the conversation. This was no longer just folklore. This was no longer just eyewitness accounts that could be dismissed as misidentification or imagination. Something had touched her car. Something had left marks that couldn't be explained away. In the years since that October night, Heather has told her story sparingly. She doesn't seek attention. She doesn't embellish. When asked to describe what she saw, her account remains consistent, detailed, and deeply unsettling. She describes the creature's eyes most often, how they looked at her with what felt like recognition, awareness, calculation. She talks about the sound of those claws on metal, a sound that still visits her in nightmares. And she shows the photographs if people need to see them. The scratches on a silver sedan, proof that something reached out and touched the boundary between the known world and whatever exists just beyond the headlights on a dark Wisconsin road. Michael Crawford had been hunting white-tailed deer in the forests of northern Pennsylvania for 30 years. He knew these woods like the lines on his own palms, could read tracks in the frost, knew the difference between a branch breaking under a bear's weight and one snapping beneath a buck's hoof. He understood the language of the forest in that deep, instinctive way that comes only from decades of patient observation. But on a November morning in 26, something moved through his woods that he couldn't identify, couldn't categorize, couldn't fit into any framework his experience had built. And whatever it was, it knew he was there. Michael had climbed into his tree stand at 4:30 that morning, well before first light, as he'd done hundreds of times before. The stand was positioned 18 feet up an old oak, overlooking a game trail he'd been watching for weeks. He'd seen a massive 8-point buck using this route, and opening day of rifle season seemed promising. The temperature hovered just above freezing, cold enough that his breath came out in small clouds, visible even in the darkness. He settled in, checked his rifle, and began the familiar meditation of waiting that every experienced hunter knows. The forest around him was quiet in that particular way of pre-dawn autumn woods, a stillness that feels almost expectant. Around 5:15, with the sky just beginning to show the faintest gray suggestion of coming dawn, Michael heard something moving through the underbrush below. His first thought was that the buck had arrived earlier than expected. The footfalls were heavy, methodical, but as he listened, something felt wrong. The rhythm wasn't quite right. Deer move with a certain pattern, even large bucks. They step, pause, test the air, step again. This was different. The steps came at irregular intervals, and there was a quality to them he couldn't quite name, a deliberateness that seemed almost thoughtful. He slowly turned his head, trying to locate the source of the sound through the darkness below. His stand faced east, and the approaching dawn gave him just enough light to see shapes, but not details. The footsteps stopped. Michael waited, controlling his breathing the way he'd trained himself to do, becoming as still as the tree that held him. 30 seconds pass. A minute. The forest held its breath with him. Then he heard it again, but now the sound was closer, much closer, directly below his position. And that's when Michael noticed something that sent the first cold thread of real unease down his spine. Whatever was down there wasn't crunching through the leaf litter the way animals do. It was placing its feet deliberately, quietly, moving with a precision that suggested intent rather than instinct. It was stalking, and slowly, with a creeping horror that started in his gut and spread outward, Michael began to suspect it was stalking him. He gripped his rifle tighter and carefully, so carefully, leaned forward to look down. What he saw in the growing light made his breath catch in his throat. Standing at the base of his tree, looking up directly at him, was something that shouldn't exist. It stood upright, easily 7 feet tall, covered in dark hair that seemed to absorb what little light the dawn provided. The proportions were wrong for a bear, too broad in the shoulders, too human in its posture. But it was the eyes that froze Michael in place. They reflected the dim morning light with a greenish gold glow, the way a deer's eyes will shine in a flashlight beam. But these eyes weren't the blank, startled gaze of prey. They held awareness. They held intelligence. And they were looking at him with what seemed like calculated interest. The creature began to circle the tree. Not frantically, not with the confused behavior of an animal that's encountered something strange. It walked around the oak in a slow, measured pattern, keeping its eyes fixed on Michael above. It was assessing. That's the word Michael would use later, when he finally told someone about this morning. It was assessing the situation. As it moved, he could see the way its muscles worked under that covering of dark hair, could see the massive hands that swung at its sides, hands with fingers, not paws. The dawn light was growing stronger now, and details emerged that Michael's mind struggled to process. The face was a nightmare blend of human and something else, with a pronounced brow ridge and a flat nose, but with an expression that conveyed thought, consideration. After completing its circle, the creature stopped on the side of the tree opposite from where Michael's climbing sticks were attached. It reached up and grabbed the trunk, and Michael's heart nearly stopped. It was testing whether it could climb. The oak was old and large, with thick bark but no low branches, the kind of tree that makes a good stand location precisely because deer and bear can't easily access it. But this thing was considerably larger and stronger than either. Michael watched, frozen in a terror he'd never experienced before, as the creature seemed to examine the trunk, running those impossibly large hands over the bark. Then it did something that transformed Michael's fear into absolute dread. It moved back around to the side where his climbing sticks were mounted. It looked at them. It reached out and touched one, wrapped its hand around the metal step, and tested its weight. It understood. That's what broke something fundamental in Michael's sense of reality. This creature understood what the climbing sticks were for. It recognized them as human construction, as a means of access. It knew that Michael had used them to climb up, and it was determining whether it could use them to climb up after him. For what felt like an eternity, but was probably only 2 or 3 minutes, the creature examined the climbing setup. Michael could hear it breathing, deep huffs of air that steamed in the cold morning. He could smell it now too, a pungent, musky odor that reminded him of wet dog mixed with something wilder, more organic. His hands trembled on his rifle, and he realized with a sick clarity that he was experiencing something every deer he'd ever hunted had felt. He was prey. The roles had reversed. The hunter had become the hunted, and he was trapped in a tree with something below that was trying to figure out how to reach him. The creature grabbed the lowest climbing stick and pulled. The mount held, but the tree shook slightly. Michael felt that tremor travel through the trunk, through the platform beneath his feet, through his entire body. He raised his rifle, sighted down at the dark mass below, finger moving toward the trigger. But something stopped him. Maybe it was the lifetime of hunter's ethics drilled into him, the absolute rule that you identify your target before you shoot. Maybe it was the paralyzing uncertainty of what this thing actually was. Or maybe, and this thought came to him later, it was the fear of what would happen if he shot it and only wounded it, if he made it angry. As if sensing his thoughts, the creature looked up at him again. In the strengthening daylight, Michael could see its face more clearly now. The eyes that met his were amber-colored, shot through with gold, impossibly human in their directness. There was no question in Michael's mind that this thing knew exactly what he was, knew what a human being was, understood the situation completely. It wasn't a dumb animal confused by an unusual circumstance. It was an intelligent being that had found a human alone in the forest and was deciding what to do about it. The creature made a sound then, a low rumbling that started deep in its chest. Not quite a growl, not quite a vocalization. Something in between. Michael felt that sound in his bones. Then, as suddenly as it had appeared, the creature dropped its hand from the climbing stick, stepped back from the tree, and looked at him one last time. The expression on that impossible face seemed almost contemplative. Then it turned and walked away, moving through the forest with surprising quiet for something so large. Within seconds, it had vanished into the gray dawn shadows between the trees. Michael stayed in his stand until full daylight, nearly 2 hours more. He didn't trust his legs to carry him down. His hands shook so badly it took him 3 tries to engage the safety on his rifle. When he finally descended, he examined the ground around his tree. The forest floor was covered in leaves, but in a patch of bare earth near the base, he found a single footprint. It was 18 inches long, human-like in shape, but far too large, with visible toe impressions. He didn't take a photo. He didn't make a cast. He just stared at it for a long moment, then climbed back down his sticks, packed up his gear, and walked out of those woods. Michael Crawford never went hunting again. He sold his rifles that winter, gave away his gear, let his hunting licenses lapse. When friends asked why, he told them he'd lost interest, that he was getting too old for sitting in the cold. It took him 4 years before he told anyone what really happened that morning. The friend he finally confided in suggested he'd seen a bear, maybe standing upright, distorted by shadows and pre-dawn light. But Michael knew bears. He'd seen dozens of them in those woods over the decades. He knew how they moved, how they sounded, how they looked at you with animal curiosity but without comprehension. What circled his tree, that November morning understood. It knew what a tree stand was. It recognized human tools. It made a conscious decision about whether to climb up after him. And most terrifying of all, it chose not to. That implied restraint, deliberation, perhaps even a kind of mercy. And that meant intelligence. The kind of intelligence that made you prey not by accident of appetite, but by choice of a thinking mind. Michael is in his late 60s now, living in a small town in Pennsylvania where the forests still press close. He doesn't go into those woods anymore, not even in daylight, not even on well-marked trails. Because once you've been on the other end of that ancient equation, once you've felt what it's like to be stalked by something that thinks, that plans, that understands, you can never see the forest the same way again. The trees that once felt like a cathedral of familiar peace now seem full of shadows that might be watching, evaluating, remembering. And somewhere in those shadows, Michael believes, there are eyes that still glow amber in the darkness, belonging to something that knows we're there. The land remembers what we choose to forget. Long before Bray Road earned its name from English-speaking surveyors, before German farmers cleared the forests and Scandinavian settlers built their homesteads along these rolling hills, the indigenous peoples of Wisconsin walked these paths with a very different understanding of what lurked in the darkness. The Oneida, the Menominee, and the Ho-Chunk nations who called this region home for countless generations carried with them stories that should make us pause before we dismiss the Beast of Bray Road as merely a modern urban legend. Because what if the sightings we've documented since the late 1980s aren't the beginning of something new, but rather the continuation of something unspeakably old? To understand the deeper roots of the Bray Road phenomenon, we must first venture into the oral traditions of the tribes who understood this land in ways we've largely forgotten. The Menominee people, whose name translates to wild rice people, maintain complex spiritual beliefs about the natural world and the beings that existed between the physical and spirit realms. Among their most closely guarded traditions were the stories of the shapeshifters, beings who could move fluidly between human and animal form, often driven by dark purposes or corrupted spiritual power. The concept that anthropologists and folklorists have come to label as skinwalker traditions extends across many indigenous cultures of North America, though each tribe maintains its own specific beliefs and terminology. Among the peoples of Wisconsin, these weren't the casual campfire tales told to frighten children. These were serious warnings passed down through generations, treated with the same gravity as lessons about dangerous animals or poisonous plants. The shapeshifters in these stories were often described as humans who had turned away from the spiritual path, who had embraced forbidden knowledge and corrupted ceremonies to gain the power to transform themselves into predatory animals. The Ho-Chunk Nation, also known as the Winnebago, spoke of the Wakas, the sacred and mysterious forces that permeate the world. Within their understanding, certain individuals could manipulate these forces, sometimes for healing and guidance, but occasionally for malevolent purposes. The transformation into animal form was not seen as mere physical metamorphosis, but as a fundamental corruption of the soul, a rejection of one's humanity in pursuit of raw, predatory power. Those who chose this path, according to the traditions, would eventually lose their ability to fully return to human form, becoming trapped in a liminal state between worlds, neither fully animal nor fully human. The Oneida people carried similar warnings about those who practiced dark magic, individuals who could assume the shapes of wolves, bears, or other fearsome creatures. What makes these traditions particularly relevant to the Bray Road mystery is the specificity of the descriptions that have been passed down through the generations. Witnesses to these shapeshifters described beings that walked on two legs like humans, but possessed the heads and features of beasts. They spoke of creatures with glowing eyes that reflected light like an animal's, but carried an intelligence that was disturbingly human. They warned of encountering such beings on lonely roads at night, of the paralyzing fear that would grip those who looked into those terrible eyes. Sound familiar? The geographic location of Bray Road itself demands closer examination. The area, now known as Elkhorn, and the surrounding Walworth County, sits in a region that served as traditional territory for multiple indigenous nations. More significantly, local historians and tribal records suggest that several important ceremonial sites and burial grounds once existed in this very area. The arrival of European settlers in the 1800s led to widespread disruption of these sacred spaces. Burial mounds were plowed under to make way for farmland. Ceremonial grounds were built over without a second thought. Trees that had served as spiritual markers for generations were felled and split into fence posts. In many indigenous traditions, disturbing burial grounds or sacred sites doesn't just constitute disrespect. It tears at the fabric that separates the physical world from the spirit realm. It awakens things that should remain at rest. Some tribal elders, speaking carefully and often anonymously, have suggested that the displacement and desecration of sacred sites in Wisconsin may have released or awakened entities that had been contained or appeased through centuries of proper ceremonial practice. Then came the waves of European immigration, bringing with them their own dark folklore. Starting in the mid-1800s, German settlers flooded into Wisconsin, drawn by the promise of affordable farmland and the familiar landscape that reminded them of their homeland. They brought their language, their customs, their agricultural techniques, and their deep-rooted belief in werewolves. The Germanic werewolf tradition, or werewolf, as it was known in the Old Tongue, possessed a richness and complexity that went far beyond the Hollywood interpretations we're familiar with today. In German folklore, becoming a werewolf wasn't always a matter of being bitten by another lycanthrope. The transformation could occur through deliberate pacts with dark forces, through curses levied by wronged parties, or sometimes through hereditary bloodlines passing the affliction from parent to child. The werewolf wasn't always a mindless beast. In many accounts, the transformed individual retained human intelligence and cunning, making them far more dangerous than any mere animal. They could plan, they could stalk specific victims, and most disturbingly, they sometimes remembered their actions when they returned to human form. The Scandinavian settlers who established communities throughout Wisconsin brought similar traditions. The Norse concept of the berserker, warriors who could channel animal rage and ferocity in battle, blurred the lines between spiritual possession and physical transformation. The Norwegian and Swedish immigrants spoke of Werewolf and Vargolf, werewolves that haunted the forests of their homelands, and they saw in the dense Wisconsin wilderness the perfect habitat for such creatures to thrive. What happened when these European werewolf traditions encountered the indigenous shapeshifter beliefs? Rather than dismissing each other's folklore as primitive superstition, the settlers and the native peoples found themselves describing remarkably similar phenomena. Both cultures spoke of beings that were neither fully human nor fully animal. Both traditions warned of creatures that hunted at night, that possessed supernatural strength and speed, that left behind tracks and traces that defied natural explanation. Both belief systems treated encounters with such beings as life-threatening emergencies, not mere flights of fancy. This confluence of folklore creates what some researchers call a resonance effect. When multiple cultural traditions, developed independently across vast distances and time periods, describe similar entities, it forces us to ask uncomfortable questions. Are these stories arising from some universal human fear, a deep evolutionary memory of predators that hunted our ancestors? Or are they independent testimonies to something that actually exists, something that different cultures have encountered and tried to explain through the framework of their own spiritual understanding? The land around Bray Road has witnessed this cultural layering for over a century and a half. The indigenous traditions never truly disappeared. They went underground, preserved in tribal communities, even as the dominant European culture tried to erase them. The German and Scandinavian werewolf lore took root in the New World, whispered in isolated farmhouses during long winter nights. These belief systems didn't replace each other. They accumulated, layer upon layer, creating a landscape saturated with centuries of fear, respect, and supernatural expectation. Consider the reports from the modern era through this historical lens. When witnesses describe a creature that walks upright like a human but possesses the head of a wolf or a bear, they're describing something that would have been instantly recognizable to a Menominee elder in 1700 or a German immigrant farmer in 1860. The consistency of the description across cultures and centuries is striking. The creature doesn't change to fit the expectations of each era. Instead, each era tries to fit the creature into its own explanatory framework. Some researchers have proposed the theory of ancestral memory, the idea that traumatic or significant experiences can somehow be encoded and passed down through generation. While controversial in scientific circles, this concept finds echoes in many indigenous traditions that speak of blood memory and inherited knowledge. Could the witnesses on Bray Road be tapping into something deeper than personal experience? Could they be accessing a reservoir of collective memory that recognizes this predator from encounters stretching back into the mists of time? The possibility that we're confronting and examining these ancient roots is profoundly unsettling. It suggests that the Beast of Bray Road isn't an anomaly, isn't a case of mistaken identity or mass hysteria or fabrication. It suggests instead that this phenomenon is old, far older than our modern skepticism and scientific certainty. It suggests that indigenous peoples and European settlers alike We're describing real encounters with something that has stalked these lands for longer than we can trace. The documentation of sightings in recent decades might not represent a new mystery emerging. It might instead represent the first time in history that these encounters are being recorded and shared beyond isolated communities. For centuries, a farmer who saw something impossible on a dark road would tell his family, perhaps a few trusted neighbors, and then fall silent, afraid of ridicule or accusations of madness. Indigenous people who encountered the shapeshifters had their own protocols and traditions for dealing with such events, but these rarely involved sharing with outsiders. Now we live in an age of instant communication, where sightings spread across the internet in minutes. The encounters that would once have remained local secrets become part of a larger pattern. We're not seeing more because there are more of these creatures. We're seeing more because we're finally looking, finally listening, finally documenting what people have been whispering about for generations. The land around Bray Road holds its secrets close. The burial mounds that once dotted these hills are mostly gone, plowed under and forgotten. The sacred groves have been harvested for timber. The ceremonial sites lie beneath parking lots and shopping centers. But according to the beliefs of the people who understood this land first, such desecration doesn't erase the spiritual significance of a place. It only makes it more volatile, more dangerous, more likely to manifest the very things we've tried so hard to forget. Perhaps the beast isn't new at all. Perhaps it's old beyond measure, and we're only now beginning to realize that the monster stories we thought were safely relegated to the past are still being written in blood and terror on dark Wisconsin roads. The bonfire crackled and popped in the cool October air of 2018, sending sparks spiraling upward into the darkness above the Henderson property. It was the kind of autumn evening that families in rural Wisconsin treasure, that perfect balance of crisp air and warmth from the flames, the smell of burning oak mixing with the scent of fallen leaves. 13 people had gathered that Saturday night for what had become an annual tradition, a reunion of sorts that brought together 3 generations of the Henderson family and a few close friends. Among them was Michael Torrance, a retired police officer from Racine County with 28 years of service, a man whose entire career had been built on observation, on separating fact from fiction, on remaining calm under pressure. Before the night ended, everything he thought he understood about the natural world would be challenged in ways he still struggles to articulate. The property sat approximately 3 miles east of Bray Road, deep enough into the countryside that the nearest neighbor was half a mile away. The house itself was a 2-story farmhouse built in 1962, surrounded on 3 sides by dense woodland that had stood largely undisturbed for generations. The family had owned this land for 43 years, and spent countless evenings exactly like this one around the fire pit they had constructed from fieldstone, pulled from the property itself. In all those years, they had seen deer, coyotes, foxes, the occasional black bear passing through. They considered themselves intimately familiar with the rhythms and residents of these woods. Nothing had prepared them for what emerged from the tree line at approximately 9:47 that evening. Sarah Henderson, the matriarch who had invited everyone to gather, noticed it first. She was seated in a lawn chair facing east, toward the section of woods that bordered the back pasture. The fire had died down slightly, and in that momentary lull in conversation that happens at any gathering, she saw movement at the edge of the clearing. At first, she assumed it was a deer, perhaps drawn by curiosity toward the light and voices. But the scale was wrong. The shape was wrong. As her eyes adjusted and the thing moved closer, stepping into the ambient glow cast by the bonfire, she felt her breath catch in her throat. Standing at the forest edge, no more than 50 yards from where they sat, was something that should not exist. It stood upright like a man but was built like no man she had ever seen. The estimate she would later give, corroborated by 5 other witnesses who got a clear look, put the creature at somewhere between 7 and 8 feet tall. Its body was covered in dark fur that appeared almost black in the firelight, though some witnesses described it as a deep charcoal gray. The head was distinctly canine, wolf-like, with a pronounced snout and ears that stood erect and alert. But it was the eyes that Sarah would remember in the sleepless nights that followed, the way they reflected the firelight with an amber glow, the way they seemed to hold an intelligence that went beyond animal instinct. Her gasp, sharp and sudden, drew the attention of the others. Her son David turned first, following her gaze, and the word that escaped his lips was barely a whisper, but carried the weight of absolute terror. Within seconds, all 13 people were on their feet, staring at the impossible thing that stood watching them from the darkness. Michael Torrance, the retired officer, instinctively moved toward the front of the group, his training overriding his shock. Later, he would describe the surge of adrenaline, the way his mind rapidly cycled through possibilities, searching for a rational explanation. A bear standing on hind legs? Wrong shape, wrong movement. Someone in a costume? The fluidity of motion, the way the muscles moved beneath the fur, made that explanation absurd. This was a living creature, and it was studying them with a focus that made his skin crawl. For what felt like an eternity, but was probably no more than 30 seconds, there was a standoff. The creature remained at the tree line, swaying slightly, its head moving as if cataloging each person around the fire. Then, with a movement that was shockingly quick for something so large, it dropped to all fours and moved north along the edge of the woods. It did not retreat into the forest. Instead, it circled, staying just beyond the clear boundary where lawn met wilderness, moving with a loping gait that covered ground with frightening speed. The group reacted with the chaos of absolute panic. Someone screamed. Children began crying. David Henderson immediately began herding people toward the house, his voice cracking as he shouted for everyone to get inside. Back door, usually left unlocked during gatherings, became a bottleneck as 13 terrified people tried to funnel through it at once. Michael Torrance and another man, James Kowalski, remained outside for a few seconds longer, their eyes tracking the creature as it moved through the shadows. James had the presence of mind to grab his cell phone, his hands shaking so badly he nearly dropped it as he tried to activate the camera. He managed to start a video recording, capturing approximately 18 seconds of footage that would later be analyzed by countless researchers and skeptics alike. Once inside, the chaos transformed into a different kind of terror. The Henderson house, with its large windows facing the property on all sides, suddenly felt less like shelter and more like a fishbowl. Someone had the sense to turn off the interior lights, and in the darkness they huddled together, trying to see out while not being seen. David moved from window to window, closing curtains and blinds, but not before several people caught glimpses of the creature continuing its circuit around the house. Jennifer Henderson, Sarah's daughter-in-law, was standing near the kitchen window on the north side of the house when she saw it pass no more than 15 feet from the glass. She described the way it moved as something between a wolf's lope and a primate's stride, a gait that seemed to shift fluidly between quadrupedal and bipedal locomotion. The fur along its back and shoulders appeared thick and shaggy, and she could see the powerful muscles bunching and releasing with each movement. Most disturbing was the fact that it turned its head to look directly at her as it passed, those amber eyes locking onto hers for just a moment before it continued on. From the living room on the west side, Michael Torrance and 2 others watched as the creature completed its circle and paused near the detached garage, approximately 40 yards from the house. It rose to its full bipedal height, and in that moment, illuminated by the security light mounted on the garage, everyone got their clearest look. Michael, a man trained in observation and testimony, noted every detail he could. The elongated snout with what appeared to be a black nose, the pointed ears that swiveled independently, tracking sounds, the arms that hung long, ending in hands or paws that seemed to have distinct fingers, the digitigrade legs bent like a dog's hind legs, ending in large paws, and the overall impression of something that was simultaneously predator and eerily human in its posture and behavior. Then it began to vocalize. The sound that came from the creature started as a low rumble that they could feel vibrating through the walls of the house. It built into a howl, but not like any wolf or coyote howl that anyone present had ever heard. This was deeper, more resonant, and there was a quality to it that seemed almost layered, as if multiple tones were being produced simultaneously. The howl rose and fell, lasting approximately 15 seconds before trailing off into a series of shorter barks or coughs. 3 people had their phones out by this point, and all 3 managed to capture audio recordings of these vocalizations. The creature's behavior over the next hour suggested an intelligence that was perhaps the most unsettling aspect of the entire encounter. Rather than attacking or fleeing, it seemed to be conducting a methodical investigation of the property. It approached the house from different angles, at different times, as if testing for weaknesses or reactions. It spent several minutes at the back door, so close that those inside could hear what sounded like sniffing, a deep inhalation and exhalation just on the other side of the wooden barrier. It circled the garage completely, at one point rising on its hind legs to peer into a window. It returned repeatedly to the now abandoned bonfire, which had burned down to glowing embers, and those watching from inside described the way it seemed to examine the lawn chairs and scattered belongings that had been left behind in the panic. During one of these circuits, the creature paused directly beneath the motion sensor light on the east side of the house. For nearly 2 minutes it stood in full illumination, seeming to study the house itself. This was when James Kowalski, who had positioned himself at an upstairs window with a better vantage point, captured the second piece of video footage. His phone's camera struggled with the distance and the contrast between the bright security light and the surrounding darkness, but for approximately 42 seconds, he recorded the creature in profile. The footage shows something large and dark, clearly bipedal, with a distinctly non-human silhouette. Enhancement of the video would later reveal what appeared to be individual guard hairs along the creature's outline, the slight movement of breathing, and at one point, the turning of its head toward the house. Inside, the group was fracturing along predictable lines. Some wanted to call 911 to get police out to the property immediately. Others, Michael Torrance among them, questioned what exactly they would tell the authorities. That they were under siege by a werewolf? That a creature from legend was circling their house? The absurdity of trying to explain what they were witnessing created a strange paralysis. Phone calls were made, not to police, but to other family members, to friends, hushed and frantic conversations, where people struggled to put into words what was happening. Several of these calls were recorded, capturing the raw fear and confusion in real time. Around 11:15, more than an hour after the initial sighting, the creature's behavior changed. Instead of circling, it moved decisively toward the tree line on the south side of the property. David Henderson, watching from a downstairs window, whispered for others to come see. 8 people crowded around various windows with southern exposure, watching as the creature paused at the edge of the woods. It turned back toward the house, one final time, and for several seconds simply stood there, a massive silhouette against the slightly lighter darkness of the open pasture. Then it turned and moved into the forest. Jennifer Henderson, still recording on her phone, captured the audio of what happened next. There was a crashing sound, branches breaking, the heavy impact of something large moving through dense undergrowth. And then, fading into the distance, another of those impossible howls, echoing through the October night. The sound seemed to come from deeper in the woods, moving away, and then it was gone. The forest returned to its normal nocturnal symphony of crickets and distant owls, as if nothing unusual had occurred at all. No one left the house that night. Adults took turns keeping watch at the windows while children were bedded down in interior rooms. Michael Torrance found himself struggling with a cognitive dissonance that threatened to overwhelm his rational mind. Everything in his training, his experience, his understanding of the world, told him that what he had witnessed was impossible. Yet, he had seen it with his own eyes, along with 12 other people. There were videos, audio recordings, a documentation trail that would be difficult to dismiss or explain away. When dawn finally came, painting the eastern sky in shades of orange and pink, a group of the men ventured outside. They moved as a unit, staying close together, eyes constantly scanning the tree line. The bonfire had gone completely cold, just a circle of white ash and blackened stones. Around it, they found the lawn chairs exactly where they had been abandoned, scattered personal items, forgotten drinks. And there, in the soft earth, near the fire pit, they found tracks. Large tracks, canine in shape but massive in scale, each print showing 4 toe pads and claw marks pressed deep into the soil. The tracks circled the fire pit, led to the house, appeared beneath several windows, and finally trailed off toward the southern tree line where the creature had disappeared. They photographed everything. The tracks, measured at just over 6 inches long and 5 inches wide. The scratch marks they found on the garage window frame, 4 parallel grooves that had removed paint and scored the wood beneath. The area beneath the back door where the ground showed evidence of disturbance, as if something heavy had been pressing against the door from outside. Physical evidence that corroborated everything they had witnessed, everything they had recorded. The videos and audio recordings spread quickly, first among family and friends, then more widely as people shared them on social media. The footage is admittedly inconclusive, hampered by poor lighting, distance, and the limitations of cell phone cameras not designed for nighttime wildlife photography. Skeptics point to the blur and grain, suggesting misidentification of known animals, tricks of light and shadow, even deliberate hoax style. But those who were there, those 13 witnesses who lived through that October night, remain unshaken in their testimony. Michael Torrance, a man who spent nearly 3 decades in law enforcement, who understands the importance of credible testimony and corroborating evidence, has spoken publicly about what he experienced. His reputation is not that of someone prone to flights of fancy or susceptible to mass hysteria. His measured, detailed account carries weight in ways that anonymous reports cannot. He describes not just what he saw, but how it made him feel. The primal fear that overrode years of training, the intellectual struggle to reconcile the impossible with the undeniable, and the lingering question that haunts him still: if such a creature exists, if it was real and not hallucination or misidentification, then what else might be out there in those dark Wisconsin woods, watching and waiting just beyond the firelight? The sun rises over Bray Road just as it does over countless other rural highways threading through Wisconsin farmland. Morning light filters through oak and maple branches, illuminating asphalt still damp with dew. Pickup trucks rumble past fields where corn grows in neat rows. A jogger waves to a passing neighbor. Everything appears perfectly ordinary, reassuringly normal. Yet something about this stretch of road refuses to release its hold on those who know its history. Even now, decades after that first night when a newspaper artist sketched what witnesses described, the sightings continue. They come less frequently to public attention these days. Witnesses have learned that speaking up invites ridicule, that sharing your story means becoming the subject of jokes at the local diner or awkward conversations at work. But the encounters themselves have not stopped. They happen in the spaces between official acknowledgement, whispered among close friends, shared in online forums under anonymous usernames. A farmer glimpses something impossibly tall crossing his back 40 at twilight and tells only his wife. A teenager driving home from a late shift sees eyes reflecting in her headlights and accelerates without mentioning it to her parents. The silence around Bray Road has grown thicker, but beneath that silence, the presence persists. The physical evidence refuses to fade with time. Deep scratch marks continue appearing on vehicles parked along isolated stretches. These gouges run parallel, 4 or 5 at a time, carved with enough force to reach bare metal beneath paint and primer. Automotive experts examine them and find themselves unable to explain the depth, the angle, the sheer strength required. Some marks appear on truck beds 7 feet above the ground. Others score the hoods of cars, suggesting something leaned down from above while the driver sat frozen inside. Footprints emerge after heavy rains, pressed into soft earth along the roadside. Wildlife biologists cast these impressions in plaster, turning them over in their hands, comparing them against every known animal in North America. The prints measure too large for wolves, which haven't established breeding populations in southern Wisconsin anyway. They show the wrong pad configuration for bears, which don't account for the bipedal stride pattern. The claw placement suggests something that walks upright more often than on all fours, yet no known primate lives in these woods. The casts sit in boxes, in basements, in the offices of researchers who cannot quite bring themselves to throw away evidence that defies their training. Photographs and videos accumulate in the digital age. Blurry shapes moving through darkness, captured on dashboard cameras. A hulking silhouette crossing a field recorded on someone's phone from a distance that frustrates clarity. Trail cameras set up to monitor deer populations occasionally trigger on something else entirely. Frames showing mass and movement that shouldn't exist in those woods. Skeptics point to the poor quality, the lack of detail, the possibility of elaborate hoaxes. Yet the sheer volume creates its own weight of suggestion. If every image can be explained away individually, what does it mean that they keep appearing, year after year, from people who have never met and likely never heard of each other's experiences? The question of misidentification seems reasonable on its surface, the logical explanation that scientists and authorities prefer. Perhaps witnesses simply encounter ordinary animals under extraordinary circumstances, their perceptions distorted by darkness, by fear, by the human brain's tendency to find patterns and assign meaning. But this explanation struggles against the remarkable consistency of descriptions across more than 3 decades. Witnesses separated by years and miles report the same details without prompting, the same hunched posture, the same elongated snout, the same silverish brown fur, the same yellow or amber eyes that catch the light, the same sense of intelligence behind those eyes, of being assessed rather than simply observed. If these are cases of misidentification, why don't the descriptions vary more? Why don't we see reports of creatures with different colors, different features, different behaviors? Random error should produce random variation, yet something holds these accounts within narrow bounds of similarity. The folklore explanation offers another escape from uncomfortable implications. Perhaps Bray Road hosts nothing more than a modern legend, a story that feeds on itself, gaining believers through repetition rather than truth. But folklore typically exists as narrative, as tale-telling, as something shared around campfires or passed between generations. It rarely leaves scratch marks requiring body shop repairs. It doesn't create footprints that can be measured and cast. The physical traces suggest something beyond collective imagination, evidence that persists whether anyone believes in it or not. Stories don't gouge metal. Legends don't leave tracks in mud. Whatever walks Bray Road operates in the material world, interacting with physical objects, existing in space that can be photographed however imperfectly. We live now in an age of unprecedented surveillance. Satellites map every inch of the planet's surface. Cameras watch from street corners, from doorbells, from the pockets of billions of people carrying smartphones everywhere they go. Wildlife cameras monitor remote forests. Drones fly overhead, capturing high-resolution imagery. Yet, in this monitored world, Bray Road keeps its secret. Whatever moves through those woods has never been captured with sufficient clarity to end debate, never been cornered with technology, never been documented beyond the threshold of plausible deniability. This absence of definitive proof becomes its own kind of evidence, raising questions about what it takes to truly know something exists. How many witnesses must come forward before we stop dismissing their accounts? How much physical evidence must accumulate before we acknowledge something genuine, however impossible, might be occurring? Perhaps what disturbs us most is not the creature itself, but what its continued elusiveness reveals about the limits of our knowledge and control. We tell ourselves we have mapped the world, cataloged its species, understood its systems. We believe our technology gives us dominion over nature, that nothing significant can hide from our instruments and methods. Bray Road suggests otherwise. It whispers that gaps remain in our understanding, that shadows persist where our lights cannot quite reach. Something can still exist on the margins, can still move through spaces we consider known and claim them as its own territory, despite our certainty that every mystery has been solved. The road itself remains unremarkable. You could drive its length in minutes, passing farms and fields, small houses with tidy yards, the everyday landscape of rural America. Nothing about the pavement or the ditches or the tree lines suggests anything unusual. Yet people who live nearby develop an instinct, an awareness of when to avoid certain stretches after dark, when to drive faster through particular curves. They understand that Bray Road holds something that doesn't care about our maps or our certainties. Whatever terror walks there has never been caught, killed, or conclusively explained. It continues in the present tense, an active mystery rather than a historical curiosity. The next time you find yourself driving a country road after sunset, when darkness presses against your windows and your headlights carve a tunnel through the night, let your eyes drift to the tree line. Notice how shadows gather beneath the branches, how the space between the trunks seems deeper than it should. Consider what might be standing there, just beyond the reach of your lights, watching you pass with eyes that reflect no beam, with intelligence that calculates whether to reveal itself or simply observe. The fear you feel, sudden and primal, comes from somewhere older than civilization, from the part of us that remembers when humans were not the apex predators, when things in the darkness considered us prey. Bray Road awakens that memory, reminds us that perhaps we never stopped being watched, that perhaps we only convinced ourselves the watchers went away, and perhaps, on certain roads, where the darkness grows thick enough, they never left at all. That's where this journey ends for tonight. If you made it all the way here, Subscribe and hit the bell for more long-form stories like this. Check out the videos on screen for more right now. Drop your own experiences in the comments below. Thanks for listening, and I'll see you in the next one.